This week on Dialogue, Tears of a Clown, a new book about Glenn Beck. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Our guest this week is Dana Milbank. Dana is a syndicated columnist with the Washington Post and a former prize-winning White House reporter. He has also provided commentary for CNN, MSNBC, CNBC, and NPR. He's the author of several books, including the national bestseller Homo Politicus. His newest book is titled Tears of a Clown: Glenn Beck and the Teabagging of America. Dana, welcome to Dialogue. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you, John.
I guess the first question, why a book on Glenn Beck? Or maybe why not a book on Glenn Beck?
Well, my next one will be on you, John, but I had to do one at a time. But
I can do that.
I did a column on Glenn Beck about the beginning of this year. And I wanted to understand what this phenomenon was. I had seen a Gallup poll that said, people were asked to volunteer who the person they most admired is, and I was amazed to find out that more people said Glenn Beck than said the Pope, for example, or all our previous living past presidents.
I think you're right that only Nelson Mandela finished ahead.
He did narrowly edged out Glenn Beck. So I want to say, what is this all about? And so I'm not really writing about a TV personality. He is that. He gets up to 3 million people a day on Fox News. He gets apparently 10 million people a week on the radio. But he's much more than that. He's a movement leader, and people really see him as sort of the de facto leader of the Tea Party movement. He's really sort of an important icon in our culture, and I just wanted to understand that and explain him to people who aren't among the 3 million who see him every day on the air.
And we'll backfill a lot of the details, but I'm almost fast-forwarding to the end when I ask you, do you understand him now, after having written the book?
Well, I think I do. I mean, he didn't cooperate for this book, obviously, no surprise there, but I feel that I do. You can't get inside a man's brain. I can't tell you, he really believes what he says or he's completely full of it. But I think, looking at his past and looking at the words he says and how he's evolved over time, I think I can get a pretty good sense of the man and what drives him.
Let me ask you about the title, because the Tea Party is offended by the term teabagging or teabag because it's a section. Was this a purposeful poke at the movement, or was this a colorful title?
It's not really a poke at the movement. It's a poke at Beck. I mean, I don't use the term teabaggers to talk about the people who are involved in the Tea Party. Right. I think it's more like Glenn Beck is the guy who's sandbagging. So we did a bit of a pun with the word there. I think he's pulling the wool over the eyes of a lot of people. Just a few weeks ago, before the election, he's supposedly the leader. The Tea Party is supposed to be this populist, grassroots movement rising up against the government. He got on the air on his radio show and said, "I'm writing a check for $10,000 to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and if any of you got a spare dollar out there, I want you to send it to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce." And to me, that that was saying, nothing says populist grassroots movement like U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So I think that's, in a way, he is deceiving a lot of the people who are following him, that they think they're supporting one type of movement, and it's really something very different.
Why don't people catch on to that part of the story? For instance, in his Forbes magazine interview, he said something to the extent that he doesn't really care about politics, that he's a businessman. But that doesn't seem to discourage the true believers.
He's a very good businessman at that. Apparently $32 million in revenues for his various enterprises annually, which is not bad at all. He is, I think, first and foremost, a brilliant entertainer, and he's able to bring people in that way. And he has absolutely passionate followers. I think part of this is because he's a recovered a drug addict and alcoholic. I think he speaks in the 12-step language very well, and he has an appeal to fundamentalist Christians. He has a certain appeal to Mormons. He's a convert to that faith. A very strong appeal to sort of end times theology, people who believe that the apocalypse is near. In fact, he has them preparing by stocking their basements with freeze-dried food and that sort of thing. So I think he is he's been able to grip an interesting coalition of Americans together, and I think they're not necessarily in a position of, questioning is what he's saying correct. They basically accept the premise to start with, and he is their unquestioned leader and teacher.
Do you have a handle on how large a segment of the American populace we're talking about?
Well, it's not that large. I mean, by cable news standards, 3 million people at 5 o'clock in the afternoon is huge.
Right.
He is very close to, say, Bill O'Reilly, who's got the primetime 8 o'clock slot on Fox News. So 3 million people is very large by cable news standards, but in a nation of 310 million people, it's not that many. But it's a very loud, a very vocal movement, and I think part of the reason he's been able to build that audience is he's brought people into the mainstream who in the previous era would have been very much on the sidelines, on the fringe. That's not entirely a good thing. I think he has brought in a lot of conspiracy theorists, some, unfortunately, or even violent characters, but essentially he's validating what had been a very extreme element in the American political culture, and now it is being given a very prominent location on Fox News.
Why do you think Fox News wouldn't move him to prime time? If his numbers are this large at 5 p.m.,
well, it's a difficult question for Fox. I mean, they obviously have other personalities as well. Beck is certainly the most powerful and polarizing personality. He's just exploded. It's only been a couple of years.
So does 5 p.m. give him a little cover? Is he a bit under the radar there?
Well, it works for Fox News in that it brings passion and energy to the network, but he's also dangerous in that he has offended a large number of people. It's very hard to get advertisers for his show now. I mean, people are advertising gold because everybody's afraid because of Glenn Beck that the currency is going to collapse. He's advertised for seed banks so that people can plant them in the garden after the apocalypse, and actually backpacks full of these freeze-dried meals that you can eat.
A good tomato and everything is unraveling around us.
It's not necessarily a commercial success for Fox News, but they need Beck's energy as well. So it's a very difficult balance for them.
I want to, the other part of the title, the Tears of the Clown, the main title, and this photo, if people didn't get a good look at it, I'll show it again. This was a publicity shot that Beck did for a magazine interview where he's crying, or at least was simulating crying. You begin one of the chapters of your book by saying, Beck has built his career on tears. Could you expand on that?
Well, he has. I mean, when he was a radio host, the people who worked with him back in those days didn't really know much about Beck as a crier. I mean, he could be an emotional guy, but what we've seen particularly since his move to Fox News is he has broken down on the set, and he's seen that this works for him, and it has happened repeatedly. Now, again, I can't say that he's doing this just for show. Certainly, when he puts menthol under his eyes, as he did for that photo shoot, he is doing it just for show. So, I mean, he's producing real tears. I don't know if they're genuine tears, but I think it's part of his role as a brilliant performer. His role model is Orson Welles, and he speaks about the way in which Welles taught him. Welles was a charlatan by his own definition, but Beck sees it as a role model in the sense that he taught Beck that anything you can believe, you can create. And
you write about Beck received the childhood gift of old radio programs that really were inspirational.
Yes, and named his original business Mercury Radio Art. So very much in that theatrical tradition.
I have to ask you about the dedication as we sit here in the Wilson Center in memory of Woodrow Wilson, fascist communist president. Talk to us about that, please.
Well, I think it's appropriate to be discussing Glenn Beck at the Wilson Center. He has an unnatural obsession with Woodrow Wilson. I can't. That's one thing I can't entirely get my arms around. But we should talk about it. Typically, if you're a right-wing commentator, what the left may throw at you is that you're a fascist, you're a Nazi, and I think Beck has headed that off by saying, no, it's my opponents who are the fascists and the Nazis. Yet at the same time, they are also the communists. And the way he has created this and said the root of all of this is progressivism. And so he goes back to the progressive era. I think it'd be a bit of a stretch to say Wilson was a progressive, but he was part of that era. And so Beck actually has on his famous blackboard the Tree of Revolution. and he puts Woodrow Wilson in the root system there underneath the trunk of the tree of revolution. And over here is Che Guevara, and there's Saul Alinsky, and he sees them all sort of mating to produce Barack Obama. So basically, his enemy is today's progressive, and progressives call themselves that because liberal was made to be a dirty word. So he's sort of drawn an unbroken line back to the progressive era. He blames Wilson for the Holocaust. He blames him for Pearl Harbor, things 17 years and more after his death. But more importantly, he sees Wilson as sort of the father of today's progressives.
Historians must hate the program because of how loose Beck plays with history. Here's something you wrote about his technique. He's not constrained by the fact-fiction divide that governs the rest of the news business. Beck calls his unique hybrid of fact and fiction faction. So he even has a name for what he does.
Yes, this was in a book he's just produced, which he said is fiction, but based on real events. But he does have historians who come on his show. They probably aren't the ones we'd consider part of the mainstream, but they will very much come, and he will validate that point of view, and he'll recommend a book, say an old conspiracy one world government theorist like Cleon Skousen, who's deceased, but he'll go and tout his book one night. Suddenly it explodes to the top of the bestseller list. So in fact, he started Beck University to give online to give an alternative version of history. So, if for somebody tuning into his show, if you accept the original premise, he will back it up with historians who will give his version of events and books that will produce that. So if you make that original leap of faith, it will all follow from there.
There's an internal logic to the whole
There is an internal
world of
logic
Beck.
to it, right? If you don't pause and say, wait a second, we're starting with something that's wrong here, and that's why many of his followers will say, in fact, one of the fellows who unfortunately was motivated to violence was saying that, Beck gave him what he needed to know, and then he goes online and researches it further, which means, of course, going to conspiracy websites. And he says, if anything you find online is contradicting Glenn Beck, just disregard that, because that's probably funded by George Soros, the liberal billionaire. So he sort of trained people to say, if it doesn't match with what I'm telling you, disregard.
Why do you think we're so susceptible to conspiracy theory? Dr. Milbank, I'm asking.
I don't know if we are as Americans, but
to some degree.
but again,
some people have estimated as much as 15 to 20% of Americans will believe just about anything. You see polls of things like alien abduction. People will get exercised because 20% believe Barack Obama was not born in the United States, but a larger percentage believe in alien abductions.
Mm-hmm. Right, and it happens in more serious areas as well. A majority of Americans believe that Saddam Hussein had a role in the September 11th attacks. Right now, there's a lot of confusion because Americans believe that Barack Obama was responsible for the TARP bank bailout. It was done before he came into office. I mean, look, it's well known, that and they're better experts than I on just sort of the general lack of civics education in America. So if you're working with sort of a low base of knowledge, it's easy. And I don't want to.
You use the word confusion, so you think it's more about confusion than it is some
Sure, but that's an American problem. I don't want to attribute that to Beck listeners. I think probably 99% of them are perfectly normal, sane people. But the problem is when there's 3 million of them, and you have 1% of them who are a bit off kilter and potentially dangerous. That is a problem.
Is there any equivalent to Glenn Beck internationally?
Based on the interviews I've been doing with foreign media, no, they find him as a completely alien creature. Now, there are historical analogies, and I did a whole chapter in a book on Father Coughlin.
Tell us about Father Coughlin. Who was Father Coughlin?
Well, he was the radio priest of the 1930s. He sort of collapsed in this whole, became virulently anti-Semitic, and of course the war made him irrelevant, and he became.
The word demagogue comes to mind.
Yeah, and I have said that every era, I guess, has its demagogues. And I think Beck is the first true demagogue of the cable news era. I've looked at some of Beck's phrases and held them up to Father Coughlin's from the 30s. It's the same sort of.
A whole chapter where comparison and contrast.
It's the paranoid strain in
End of the world as
politics.
We know it.
Yes, a lot of that, and they want to take us over. It's the Europeans want to take us over. It was the League of Nations, of course, that Coughlin was worried about, and now Beck sees the same thing in the United Nations. nations.
And Coughlin's following was actually much larger than that.
Certainly given the population at the time, but yes, he was hugely dominant with his radio broadcasts.
Beck would not agree to an interview, and then before the book was even written, talked about it as a smear. And you use that in the book. You use Beck's own words, that it can't be a smear if you're using someone's own words to chronicle their activities.
Right. That's sort of Beck's philosophy. And the other way he has gone about his business is said, look, if I toss out an allegation and you don't disagree with it, you have agreed to it. So he'll have on his set the red phone, and he'll say the most outrageous thing about, the White House. They're a bunch of Maoists, and because they don't call him on his red phone,
as if like in Commissioner Gordon's office, the Batman will call.
Because they don't call him to deny it, because obviously they're not going to get mixed up in that. Therefore, they agree to it. So Beck has not responded to this book, so he has therefore endorsed every word in it. I'd like to report. Every single word is endorsed by Glenn Beck.
Do you consider yourself in a minor feud with Bill O'Reilly and Fox News?
Not really. I mean, I have lots of friends who I've worked with covering the White House beat and Capitol Hill at Fox News. They have a lot of first-rate journalists.
You make clear in the book, you write that this is not an indictment of Fox News.
No, I've been on their airways. I doubt they'll have me back again. But I think they have a real a challenge there to balance journalism with opinion, and opinion is almost so thoroughly dominating. So I feel bad for a guy like Bret Baier, who's trying to be an honest newscaster in the middle of this.
Can you be an honest newscaster in that environment? If Glenn Beck is a poster child for it.
You can try, but it's that's not where the energy is, and that's a real tension that they're going to have to resolve. It's not unique. I mean, MSNBC has a similar thing going on the left, but Fox is a much larger, more successful enterprise at this point.
Let's see, one of the more surprising things I read in the book is a bit of factual information that could seem somewhat innocuous, that his first show was January 19th, 2009. And my reaction was, it seems like he's been with us longer than that. Do you have that feeling about Beck?
He just exploded onto the scene. I mean, he was with us in the sense that he was a national radio commentator for the last 10 years or so. He was on CNN, but he didn't really have that same following.
He hadn't hit his stride.
No, and I think what happened is it was perfect timing, and part was the transfer to Fox News, but also the economic collapse. Demagogues do well because of bad times. If you run around saying the end is near and the economy's humming along, you're not going to get a lot of traction.
Feels like the end is near when things are bad.
Exactly, and so Americans are very distrustful of the government when this sort of thing happens. So it's a very fertile audience for that. And to Beck's credit, I don't know whether he believes the things he says or how often, but he definitely had a good sense of where things were going and got out in front of it. Now, at some point, what happens to a demagogue? You either
does he run out of steam?
You flame out and say something outrageous, and sort of the Coughlin idea, or you just sort of fade away. And I suspect Beck is a really smart guy, and he knows where the line is, when he's crossed it, when to pull back. I think much more likely what happens is the economy, eventually improves. People begin to feel a little bit better about where things are headed, and then he just has less relevance. I don't doubt that he can reinvent himself again. Maybe he'll be a happy Beck this time. But
about that, you write about that, and that his personal story can be compelling and inspirational. Sure, a recovered alcoholic, a recovered drug addict, but then his public message is dark, apocalyptic, and angry. Did you gain any insight into this dichotomy?
Well, in a way,
contradiction, perhaps even.
I'm not sure it is a contradiction. I mean, he's constantly talking in sort of the 12-step language, as we discussed, and he sees an analogy. He was the guy who was waking up on the bathroom floor, and he now says the nation is waking up on the bathroom floor morning after morning, addicted to debt, and he talks in the same sort of the language of addiction about healing and recovering the nation. I mean, there is this dark doomsday strain, but there's also an element of religious salvation in it as well, right? The last week or so, he's been talking about building lifeboats for the saving civilization.
Yeah, he invokes religion. He observed that Jesus doesn't want cap and trade, for example.
For example, right?
Is he a religious leader?
Beck will never be sort of a leader of religious conservatives in America just because he chose Mormonism as his faith, and not necessarily fairly, but most evangelical Protestants will not accept a Mormon as sort of a leader of the religious right in America. However, as we saw in his appearance on the National Mall on the anniversary of Martin Luther King's appearance at the Lincoln Memorial, he can deliver a very powerful religious message. So he came from the libertarian strain in conservatism, but he's also embraced the other part of the conservative movement, the social conservatism. So he speaks that language. I don't think he ever gets traction as a religious figure.
Based on the event on the Mall, you chronicle, as we discussed earlier, the playbook of Father Coughlin and how it might relate. Talk about what Beck has taken from his faith of choice, Mormon. What did he learn from that seems to be part of his act?
Well, it all...
And when I say act, I'm saying that as shorthand. As you said, we're not sure what Mr. Beck believes or what's an act.
I mean, look, we can say that, you can hold up things and say, look, Beck was, by his own account, a liberal, had a ponytail, supported abortion rights. As recently as September of 2008, when George Bush was the president, he supported the TARP bailout bill and said the only problem with it is it's not big enough and all those weasels in Washington know it. Then now it's suddenly the centerpiece of calling the Bush's successor a socialist who's destroying this country. So clearly he changes some views out of convenience, but I can't say what he believes in his heart, and I'm not going to question the man's religion for sure. And even if you are saying something that you don't believe, if you keep saying it night after night, just your mind begins to believe it at some point. So I wouldn't. I don't know how much. Some of it has to be an act. We certainly can't say all of it is an act. Now, the Mormonism is interesting. He doesn't often speak about Mormonism for obvious reasons when he's on the air, but there are ways in which Mormons would recognize what he's talking about. I wrote in a book about something called the White Horse Prophecy, which goes back to the very beginnings of the faith. It's not necessarily a mainstream part of the faith, but it holds that there will be a point at which the Constitution is, quote, hanging by a thread, and the leaders of the Mormon Church will step in to save the Constitution and the country. And Beck is often talking about the Constitution hanging by a thread, and in a ways that people who are familiar with the White Horse Prophecy would recognize, but the rest of the vast majority of Americans wouldn't notice at all. We spoke earlier about Cleon Skousen, who was a Mormon conspiracy theorist, very much on the fringes of the Mormon Church, but Beck is constantly touting his work, his visions of one world government. So there are recognizable ways to a Mormon, or at least a certain segment of Mormons. But Beck's tries to make a much more non-denominational religious appeal. Another
aspect of the Beck story that we get bits and pieces of is the potential that there are strained relations within Fox. Mm-hmm. What can you tell us about that? About that he's the only Fox personality who has an office off-site, not at the Fox headquarters, that there may be some tension there.
I mean, Fox has been very important to Beck to increase his visibility, but it's a tiny part of the Beck empire. I mean, we spoke of $32 million in annual revenues. He only gets $2.5 million from Fox. Now, I'd take only $2.5 million, but so we're talking less than 10%. So it's an important relationship, but Beck does not, at this point, necessarily need Fox.
Is he too big for Fox now?
Well, no. I mean, they've got some other mammoth personalities there. He may be too dangerous for Fox, and he brings in a lot of energy, a lot of viewership, does not bring in a lot of advertisers, and that there's some evidence that has spread to some of the other shows, and it's made it sort of a toxic environment. So that's what the tension is there, and of course Fox does have legitimate reporters, correspondents, producers, and they have a lot of trouble. I guess luckily for them, Beck doesn't often even have guests on his show. It's very frequently an hour-long monologue, or if he does have guests, it'll be a few like-minded thinkers.
Beyond Beck's danger to Fox's economic model, is he dangerous? Do you really believe that he can incite? You touch on that in the book, but you're like a reporter. You pull back without defining smoking gun evidence.
Well, yeah, and I do want to be very careful because it's a serious allegation, and I don't want to say anybody who watches Glenn Beck who goes out and does something violent, therefore it's Glenn Beck's fault. That's preposterous. You can't do that. But there is something of a pattern here, and where what the problem here is Beck has, I mean, he's constantly talking about violent imagery on the show. You know, am I poisoning Nancy Pelosi?
Killing Michael Moore.
Hitting Charlie Rangel over the head with a shovel, whatever it is. You know, secession. You know, grab a torch. You know, things that are not necessarily meant to suggest violence. But he has also said to his followers, "I want you to hear what I'm saying in between the sentences, and hear these things. I'll be shouting them to you, even if I'm not allowed to say them." So that's sort of a wink and a nod, and the unbalanced person out there is going to say, aha, he is telling me that I should go out and shoot these cops. And unfortunately, we have had a few cases where there have been, you know, killings of police in Pittsburgh, a shootout with the cops. And
the shooter's
Oakland.
mother said that Beck was a big influence. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, in the Oakland case, the shooter himself said that he was riled up by Glenn Beck. In this case, he thought Beck was talking about George Soros, and the guy took it one step further online and decided there was some radical conspiracy between Obama and Soros to cause the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, and the guy just exploded. Now, excuse me, I think that it would be better if Beck could pull back from that and be more clear that he is not advocating violence. But I think it's quite obvious that you know, he wants to bring in this segment of the population and doesn't want to alienate them.
Final quick thought, Dana. And this is a difficult thing to quantify, but I don't know how to do it. A scale of 1 to 10, 1 insignificant, 10 one of the major political forces of our times. How do we rate Beck's influence on public policy and the body politic and the whole way we get business done in this town and in this country?
I think he's as important as any certain elected official
including the president.
Well, I mean, certainly on the right, I was going to say.
Right,
so
okay.
Anybody who wants to be the president, and Republican presidential nominee in 2012 has to get Beck's seal of approval. And you often hear the Republicans in the Congress repeating on the House floor that which Glenn Beck said on the television the night before.
That's pretty high on the scale. Dana, thank you very much.
My pleasure, John.
And thank you for joining us as well. Here's the book again, Tears of a Clown, Glenn Beck and the Teabagging of America by Dana Milbank. And we'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for watching.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.